Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here tonight. I'm Lauren Gregory. I'm continuing my series on apologetics. As you know, if you're watching this, the church has been flooded by the rain. Now, if you saw online, they were able to get in today and examine it. They're going to start cleaning it tomorrow, and they're inviting people to come who can and help them clean. If you can do that, it'd be great. We need to keep the church in prayer and our pastor in prayer over this. And saying that, why don't we go ahead and open with prayer tonight? Our Heavenly Father, we love you, God. We thank you that you are in control, Father. And this caught us by surprise, but it did not catch you by surprise. And you're going to use this for your glory somehow, Father. And so we just pray, God, that you will help Pastor Allen as he leads us through this time. Lord, I pray that the cleaning would come easily and quickly, Father, and we'd restore the church quickly. And then you just bless the people who clean and just bless the meeting tonight and anoint me, Father, as I share this lesson. And I just thank you for everyone who's listening. We ask this all, Lord, in your holy name. Amen. Well, we're continuing our lessons on apologetics. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about icons of evolution. Now, I had given you notes last week. I understand that the notes are available on Facebook. You should see them there. They will also be available on the YouTube app or YouTube when he puts it on there. So that'll be great. But tonight we're talking about icons of evolution. Now, an icon is a picture representing an item or a thought. It can be very powerful in selling ideas to people. You know, we always say seeing is believing. And so that's what we're really talking about. So we're talking about images that they use in teaching evolution and the problems with it. I want to open first with a couple of scriptures and then a couple of quotes. Psalms 102:25 says, "In the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands." It's pretty clear. God did it in the beginning. He laid everything out. He created everything. We didn't come from nothing. We didn't suddenly spring up. God created it. Romans 1:24 and 25 is great. It says, "Therefore God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised." Amen. Here Paul is telling us that he gave them over to the sins, and we can see that today because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Evolution is a lie. It's a cult. And we're going to be teaching that in the next few weeks. And it says they worshiped and served created things. That's what evolution does. It worships creation. That creation, nature created us, which nature doesn't create anything. I mean, you know, their life is, but God does that. So they worship nature. And that's why they are so fanatical about protecting our planet. Now, yes, we should protect our planet. Yes, we should be worried about the environment, but we shouldn't be extreme. I want to give you a quote here from Ernst Mayr from the Scientific American, July 2000. It says, "No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we know to be a simple fact." That's the way they think. To them, this is a proven fact, even though there absolutely isn't proof. In fact, one creationist offered $1,000 to anyone that could give him proof of evolution, and so far nobody has done that. There isn't any. And yet they call it a fact because they don't want to believe in God. Now, I'm going to be talking about these icons. This is information that comes from a book by Jonathan Wells called Icons of Evolution. He actually gives 10 examples, but some of them I felt like were no longer current. I felt like these were more relevant, and time restraints, I thought I'd just give these 5. And they're a little technical, and I may stumble over the words, but I'm going to do my best. But the point is to understand what we're talking about. And not, like I said last week, this is not about making me look intelligent, because I'm not going to if I stumble over the words. It is about showing you why evolution is wrong and why God is our creator. The first icon we're going to discuss is the Miller-Urey experiment. And the second one will be Darwin's Tree of Life. The third one is Haeckel's embryos. The fourth one is Darwin's finches. And the fifth one is From Ape to Human, the ultimate icon. Now, Stephen Jay Gould describes this. He's talking about these images. He said the iconography, I told you I'd say it wrong, of persuasion strikes even closer than words to the core of our being. Every demagogue, every humorist, even advertising executive has known and exploited the evocative power of well-chosen picture. But many of our pictures are incarnations or concepts masquerading as neutral descriptions of nature. These are most potent sources of conformity, since ideas passing as descriptions lead us to equate the tentative with the unambiguously factual. What he's saying here is these pictures, like I said, when we see a picture, we tend to think, well, it must be true. We see that. And so we see that, even though it's a made up picture, it doesn't matter. People are often misled by these things, and these pictures are very misleading. And I want to read another one here from Phil Johnson in The Wedge of Truth. You're going to love this. This is why they don't tell people these are phony. From time to time, educational leaders contemplate starting a new kind of educational program to prepare science students to debate the issues in public. Such a program would be a disaster for the Darwinists if it ever got off the ground, because you can't teach students to argue a case completely without familiarizing them with the best arguments on the other side. To refute Michael Behe and William Dobrinsky, the students would have to study their books, and in the process they would learn about irreducible complexity and the nature of complex specified genetic information. The students would also need to learn about such things as the defects in the peppered moth story, the fraud in the Haeckel embryo drawings, and the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, and what Darwinists really believe about the implications of Darwinism for religion. Before this education went very far, the authorities would have mutiny on their hands. The Darwinists cannot change their tactics because any true education in evolution would have the clear light of analysis on assumptions that cannot survive it. In other words, what he's saying, they can't teach the truth because if they did, no one would believe it. And he's right. They don't teach this. They fight it. They mock people who teach it. Well, that's what we do nowadays anyway. When we don't like what somebody said, we mock them rather than defend them. Or give arguments against them. So that's what they do in evolution. They simply call, well, you're just a religious nut, or you don't know what you're talking about. You're uneducated. You religious people, you're primitive. Makes me think of something. I read an article a few years ago. It was about the 10 smartest people in the world. We're talking about people with IQs over 180, some over 200. Out of 10 of them, 8 believed in God. Out of the 10, 6 were Christian. Isn't that astonishing? It's not ignorant to believe in God. Intelligence demands it, and education demands it. The first one we're going to talk about, number 1, is the Miller-Urey experiment. This is important because this is in every book. This is when people say, didn't they create life in a test tube? This is what they point to, and they didn't create life in a test tube, but that's what they say. In the 1920s, the Upper-Halden hypothesis surmised that chemicals produced in the atmosphere dissolved in the primordial seas to form a hot dilute soup, from which the first living cells emerged. Now, this captured the imagination of many scientists. It's an untested hypothesis until the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953. It found its way into high school and college biology textbooks. Now, this experiment was interesting because of what it did. There's a picture here. The equipment consisted of a vacuum line, a high voltage spark electrodes, condenser with circular cold water to prevent backflow, flask for boiling water and collecting reaction products, sealed tube, broken later to remove reaction products for analysis. If you can see in the picture, it's a circle. They heat it up, they had the chemicals, and then it goes over and cools in the other tube and formed what they found. Now, some basic terminology to understand what we're talking about. Of course, most of you know what atoms are. They're the basic units of matter. Molecules are a specific arrangement of atoms, like H2O is water. Amino acids are specific arrangements of molecules. Of course, that's found in protein, which are specific arranged amino acids. Now, amino acids and proteins are what we're built of. So that's what they were trying to prove, that this could come together and form what could be the basis of life. Now, the experimental results were the Miller-Urey device produced, either in this experiment or subsequent variations, many of the basic building blocks of proteins, amino acids, nucleic acids, ribose, purines, and that's a good one, pyrimidines, polysaccharides, sugars, fats, fatty acids, and glycerol. No, I'm going to stumble. The building blocks were found, not the actual macromolecules. Along with these building blocks, there were many other molecules not found in organisms. Here's the other products. There was tar, which was 85% of it, which is toxic. There was carbonic acids, which are toxic, 13, and just 2% amino acids. So basically, it only created a handful of amino acids, and most of it was toxic. So if it had created that, life wouldn't have been able to form in it. Some of the other things that he did, the experiment does not prove life evolved from non-life. The Miller-Urey experiment assumed an early atmosphere consisting of ammonia, water, hydrogen, and methane. So did the primitive atmosphere really lack oxygen? Well, we know oxygen must have been there because the lighter gases would have escaped into the atmosphere. Chemical evolution would have been inhibited by oxygen. Let's kind of understand, because we need oxygen, right? But when you understand what happens to things when they're exposed to oxygen, metal rusts, corrodes. Oxygen is hard on stuff, even though it's necessary for life, which is kind of funny. But that's the way it works. Geologists determined by examining rocks dated to be 3.7 billion years old. Now, they're not that old, but we'll go with what they said, that the Earth had an oxygen atmosphere. In other words, it's always had oxygen. There was never an atmosphere that had ammonia. Origin of life scientists ignored the evidence for oxygen in the early Earth atmosphere. Oxygen is an oxidizing agent and would inhibit communal evolution, which I already said. The Miller-Urey experiment assumed the wrong gas mixture. Experiment produced the wrong amino acids, right-handed rather than left-handed. Now, it's got a picture here of the hands. This is a little hard to understand. Just understand that the amino acids it created were not building blocks for life. They were useless. And so the whole experiment was a failure. Yet this is still taught in our textbooks. And as I said, people use this to say, well, what, didn't somebody create life in a test tube? No, they didn't. The test was a failure, and yet they still talk about it, saying that it produced amino acids and proved that life could have formed. Robert George, PhD, said, the likelihood of life having occurred through a chemical accident is for all intents and purposes 0. It's true, it's impossible. Freeman Dyson, The Origins of Life, said, since Miller's beguiling picture of a pond full of dissolved amino acids under a reducing atmosphere has been discredited, a new beguiling picture has come to take its place. The new picture has life originating in a hot, deep, dark little hole on the ocean floor. In other words, he's trying to come up with a new reason where it came from. They always try to find something. The conclusion is, textbooks include a picture of this apparatus with caption claiming or implying that the experiment simulated conditions on the early Earth, no mention of the experiment's flaws, leaves students with the impression that it demonstrates how life's building blocks formed in early Earth. In other words, they still teach this, and yet it's known to be false. I mean, this is not secret. The scientists know this, but they teach it anyway because they want people to believe it. The next one, some of you may have heard of this, some of you may not. This one's a little odd, but we'll explain it. It's called Darwin's Tree of Life. Yeah, there's the picture of it. It starts out with a basis and then it branches out into other lives. In other words, it started out with one life form and eventually evolved into more and more and more, and branching out into many limbs and many things. And that's the way he pictured it. Charles Darwin said, the affinities of all beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. The green and budding twigs may represent existing species, and those produced during each former year may represent the long succession of extinct species. The limbs divided into great branches, and these into lesser and lesser branches. From the branch, so by generation, I believe it has been with the tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches with the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. So this is what Darwin taught. They also teach, in the evolution of life, evolutionists believe that all species evolved over billions of years from a common ancestor. The 10 strata systems that geologists use, the Cambrian, Ordovician, I should have practiced these again, My wife warned me, Cerulean, Devonian, Cambodius, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and Tertiary. I got some of them right. Compose the standard geologic column and are claimed by many to contain the major proof of evolutionary theory. Several erroneous notions have been attached to the geologic column. Now you'll see a picture of this, and we've seen this everywhere in classrooms. There it is. Everywhere in classrooms and all over walls, they show this column. The problem is the following is the most common misconception. The geologic column was not composed by assembling a chronology, of periods or eras found in the strata, but by grouping them into defined sequences of sedimentary strata called systems. The periods and eras were later appended to the system terminology of the geologic column, transforming it into the geologic timescale. The problem is the geologic column is wrong. Rock layers are not even close to what it shows. Now here's something you need to understand. They show this as if it started out and you could see this in the rock layers. Even I remember watching a comedy a while back, and this guy was telling this young lady, he said, we see it in there. You don't see it. Nowhere on Earth is anything in the fossil record in evolutionary order. It's not, and we'll go into that more later, and some of it tonight. But it's not. It's all made up. Charles Darwin said this, The Origin of the Species. He said, why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organ chain, and this is the most obvious and serious objection what can be urged against my theory. Now this is interesting. This is Charles Darwin himself. Now he believed that someday they would find it. And what he's saying is nowhere in the rock strata do we find anything between. If evolution were true, there would not only be, dinosaurs, it would be what was before the dinosaurs and what came after the dinosaurs. And there would be, things going along gradual. And there would be even things that failed in evolutionary. There'd be things that, 5 arms or something that didn't work. But we don't see any of that. All we see is perfectly formed creatures, perfectly formed animals, perfectly formed fish, birds. There is no intermittent fossil. It just doesn't exist. And as I said, it's never in evolutionary order. David Berlinski said, there is no question that such gap exists. A big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. Now what they're talking about is, before that, they found a few of the small, what am I trying to say here? Well, fossils of small organisms. But all of a sudden, during this Cambrian period, everything appears. And this is frustrating for the evolutionists because it's not supposed to work that way. But pretty much everything we found is within that layer. And in fact, they often find some things that should be before things. Like they found human remains below dinosaur remains. The way they explained this is they must have been miners, and they had dug underneath it and died, which is hilarious because they also found a woman and a child beneath it. So that kind of shoots that down. Ariel Roth said, however, we have virtually no evidence in the fossil record or elsewhere for any of the changes proposed during this immensity time of time, but the public hears nothing of this problem. They don't tell anybody. They don't want you to know that it's a problem, that it doesn't exist. They want you to believe in the fossil record that they found all this, they've proven it, and they're lying. They are literally lying. They don't care because they still believe it's true. Anybody who believes a lie long enough will speak the lie. We see that today. People lie all the time and believe it. See, here's the problem. Living things are very different. The fossil record shows that division differences appear at the lowest levels, i.e. in the Cambrian period. This has been referred to as the Cambrian explosion. There is no fossil record evidence connecting Cambrian mammals to organisms preceding them. There is no long history of gradual divergence predicted by Darwin. The Cambrian explosion gave rise to most of the animal divisions alive today, as well as some divisions that are now extinct. I love this picture this person uses. Evolution claims it shows this tree. Reality is it's more like grass. It all came up at once. And this is a real problem for the evolutionists. I got to stop rocking back and forth my chair. In an attempt to preserve Darwin's theory, paleontologists have argued the absence of Precambrian ancestors is due to the fragmentary fossil record. In other words, it's there because it's not a good record. It's not there. Any Precambrian ancestors would not have fossilized because they were too small or because they were soft-bodied. Molecular comparisons among living organisms point to a hypothetical common ancestor hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian. Now that's what they say, but the fossil record and the molecular evidence have uprooted Darwin's tree of life. Colin Patterson, the senior pathologist at the British Museum of Natural History, London, said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Nothing. That's astonishing because they teach this. Ernst Mayr said, "Given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document gradual steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants. But this is not what paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every division series." That's pretty crazy, isn't it? If you remember, if you watched Jurassic Park, and in the first one, the paleontologist is telling them how he believed they tracked it, they were in packs and they did this and did that. They make all that stuff up. There's nothing to prove it. They just make this stuff up. Okay, I just got a message on my screen from something. I'm trying to figure out, get it off. Okay. John Woodmorap says 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface does not have even 3 geological periods appearing in correct consecutive order. It becomes an overall exercise of gargantuan special pleading and imagination for the evolutionary uniformitarianism paradigm to maintain that there were ever geographic periods. They don't exist. And uniformitarianism was the beginning of all this. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about geology. It was the beginnings of a lot of this. Jerry Alder says, "In the fossil record, missing links are the rule. The story of life is as disjointed as a silent newsreel in which species succeed one another as abruptly as Balkan prime ministers. The more scientists have searched for the transitional forms between species, the more they've been frustrated. Evidence from fossil now points overwhelmingly away from the classical Darwinianism which most Americans learned in high school, that new species evolved out of existing ones from a gradual accumulation of small changes, each of which helps the organism survive and compete in the environment." Now, some people have come up with theories that, well, maybe things abruptly changed. And I think they call it the deviating septum or something like that. I don't have it in my notes, I should. But that's just made up. It's a theory they have to explain what, because they don't find what they thought they'd find. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. Stephen Jay Gould said, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet we preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection. We view our data as so bad that we never see the process we profess to study." It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Here's another quote from Darwin in The Origin of the Species. "These difficulties and objections may be classified under the following heads. Firstly, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being as we can see them well defined? Lastly, looking not to any one time but to all time, if my theory be true, numerous intermediate varieties linking most closely to all species in the same group together must assuredly have existed, but the process of natural selection constantly tends, as to have been often remarked, to exterminate the parent forms and intermediate links. Consequently, evidence of their former existence could be found only amongst fossil remains, which are preserved, as we shall see in future chapter attempt to show, in an extremely imperfect and intermediate record. In other words, it's not there. It doesn't exist, and he knew that, but he continued to teach it anyway. I'm going to talk about one more thing, dating fossils. Niles Eldridge tells, this is hilarious. Paleontologists cannot operate this way. There simply is no way to look at a fossil and say how old it is unless you know the age of the rocks it comes from. And this possesses something of a problem. If we date the rocks by their fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about the patterns of evolution timescale in the fossil record? What he's saying, and they do this, they date the rocks by the fossils and the fossils by the rocks. Now, I know you're going to laugh and say that's stupid, but I've seen it in textbooks. We homeschooled our boys, and for a while we used materials from public schools. It was after I read that we changed it, because it actually said in their textbook that they were dating the fossils by the rocks and dating the rocks by the fossils. See, the age of the Earth is arbitrary. They say, well, we've got radiometric dating, but we're going to talk about that later, and it's nonsense. They date things the way they want to. In fact, in radiometric dating, they often come out with different things, and they keep testing until they get the answer they want, which is very common in these things. So, you know, they basically, you know, because they believe this, and so this is the way it has to be, so they just change the data to match. The next one is Haeckel's embryos. Now, this is important because this is why we have abortion. When they did Roe versus Wade, they used this in testimony to say that the baby is not human when it's in the womb, and it's not fully human until the final trimester. And, you know, but this was all made up. Now, these embryos shown from right to left are fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, calf, rabbit, and human, representing 5 of the 7 vertebrate classes. Haeckel omitted 2 classes of vertebrate, jawless and cartilage fishes, entirely, and half the embryos are mammals, thus using a biased sample. In other words, what he said was, this is the way a baby in the womb starts out, or other babies in their wombs. They start out and you go through the evolutionary process from being some sort of a creature to a fish, then they turn into kind of an ape-like thing, and then they turn into whatever they're going to be, whatever they supposedly go through the evolutionary process in the embryo. Now, Darwin believed this too. He said, the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but becomes, when fully developed, widely dissimilar. With many animals, the embryonic or larval stages show us, more or less completely, the condition of the progenitor of the whole group in its adult state. I said that right. Darwin considered these similarities in early embryos by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory. Here's the problem. It was Haeckel's fraud. The dissimilar life of early embryos has been well known for more than a century. Haeckel's drawings are misleading in 3 ways. They include only those classes and orders that come closely to fitting Haeckel's theory. They distort the embryos they purport to show, and they entirely omit earlier stages in which vertebrate embryos look different. In other words, he handpicked things and changed them and made them to match. Now, we know now, we have video of babies in a womb, and by the 10th week, it's a human being. And that's the problem with abortion. By the time a woman knows she's pregnant, it's a person. Now, it's not completely developed, but it has a heartbeat. It's formed its main parts. It moves around by itself. He lied. And because of this, millions upon millions of babies have been murdered. And it's a travesty. But this is what evolution does. It lies to people and creates havoc. Now, Haeckel versus reality. The evidence is twisted to fit a theory. Fuduyama, the evolutionist textbook writer, says, as such, if textbooks use the drawing at all, it is as a historical example and is a way to illustrate the concept in such a way the students are able to grasp it immediately. Even if the drawings are fraudulent, they can still be used for this purpose because the concept they illustrate by no means is fraudulent. I'm sorry. That just cracks me up. In other words, you know, we know it's all false, but we still use it because it's not false. And that's evolutionary thinking. And the deception continues. It's time for a for a dose of critical thinking, folks. I'm doing the wrong thing there. The next one is Darwin's finches. Now this is interesting because this was supposedly what he based his theory on. And as you're going to find as we read this, that's not the case. It says Darwin studied 13 species of finches in the Galapagos Islands while on the voyage in 1835. The finches differ mainly in size and shape of their beaks. The various species were concluded to be the result of natural selection, since the beaks of the finches are adapted to the different foods they eat. More evidence for natural selection? First of all, it's undeserved credit. Many biologist textbooks give Darwin undeserved credit for the use of the finches as an example of natural selection in the theory of evolution. The facts are, the finches are not discussed by Darwin's diary, except for one passing reference. The finches are never mentioned in Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. The natural selection observed in the 1970s reversed direction soon after, resulting in no net evolutionary change. Several finch species appear to be merging through hybridization. In other words, what happened was they went back later and things changed, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it went back the way it was, plus a lot of them started mating together and it completely dissolved what he saw. Soloway says Darwin has increasingly given credit after 1947 for finches he never saw and for observations and insights about them he never made. George Johnson says Darwin attributed the differences in bill size and feeding habits among these finches to evolution that occurred after their ancestors migrated to the Galapagos Islands. In other words, what he saw, he just said, okay, it must have evolved that way. Grant's experience in 1970. Grant's observations. Drought reduced the availability of seeds, resulting in a 15% reduction of one of the island's medium ground finch population. Survivors tend to have slightly larger bodies and beaks. Natural selection favored those birds, capable of cracking the tough large seeds that remain. The average beak depth increased about 5%. Peter Grant concluded natural selection can produce changes in beaks. This could also explain the origin of the species among Darwin's finches. It would require 20 such selection events to transform one species into another. With one drought each 10 years, this would take only 200 years. But chromosome studies show no differences among the finches. No natural selection in the wild has been observed. Finches are still finches. You realize it's over 100 years later after Darwin saw them, and they're still finches. Grant's later experiences, when he arranged return, increased in finch population, and the average beak size returned to its previous size. Oscillating selection cannot produce any net change in Darwin's finches. Several species of finches appear to be merging into one, as I'm saying they're all mating. The finches seem to be oscillating between diverging and merging. Perhaps there aren't many different species at all. In other words, it never happened. It simply changes over time because of conditions. And we see that in nature. The polar bears are adapted for living in a cold climate. God designed them that way. It's not evolution. It's intelligent design. First of all, he exaggerated the evidence. The National Academy of Science booklet describes Darwin's finches as a particular compelling example on the origin of the species. Example explains how Grant showed that a single year of drought on the islands can drive evolutionary changes in the finches, and that if the droughts occur once about every 10 years on the islands, a new species might arise about every 200 years. They're still teaching it. They're still saying this proves evolution when it's all been disproved, and they know that it's not true. The missing links are still missing. The last icon I want to cover, we're doing okay on time, aren't we? Is From Ape to Human, the ultimate icon, Darwin's human evolutionary theory. There's a picture on here that he's going to bring up. You will see this in every science room, in every classroom, in every college and high school. It's fascinating because it's completely made up. First of all, it shows us evolving from chimps, which is funny because an evolutionist will tell you we did not evolve from chimps, that we evolved from the same things as chimps did, although the books teach we evolved from chimps, which is typical of evolution. The drawing was developed before there was any so-called evidence. It has been reproduced in most biology textbooks and in museum exhibits. Numerous fossils were discovered that appeared to be the transitional links in the evolutionary chain leading to today's human beings. We're going to discuss those. It has been shown that many interpretations of fossil evidence for human evolution were influenced by personal beliefs and prejudices. In other words, when they drew this, they drew it the way they wanted to see it. The hominid fossils they're talking about, as you've all probably heard of Neanderthal man, they've been known now to be Homo sapiens. Java man was an artificial construct. Piltdown man proven to be a hoax. Nebraska man was an extinct pig. Brahmopithecus, an orangutan, and Lucy is a make-believe creature. We're going to talk about some of these. The Piltdown man is a famous hoax consisting of fragments of a skull and a jawbone collected in 1912 from a gravel pit at Piltdown in a village near Euclid, East Sussex. The fragments were thought by many experts of the day to be fossilized remains of a hitherto unknown form of early human. The Latin name, oh boy, Yumnothropus dawsoni. Okay, that's close. Dawson's Dawn Man, after the collector Charles Dawson, was given to the specimen. The significance of the specimen remained the subject of controversy until it was exposed in 1953 as a forgery, consisting of the lower jawbone of an orangutan combined with the skull of a fully developed male human. In other words, he faked it. They didn't dig him up there at all. He simply made it up. The Nebraska man was the name applied to the popular press. Oh, Hesperopithecus Harold Cookie, a alleged species of ape. Hesperopithecus, well, means ape of the Western world, and it was heralded as the first higher primate of North America. Though not a deliberate hoax, the classification proved to be a mistake. It was originally described by Henry Fairfield Osborn in 1922 on the basis of a tooth found in Nebraska by a rancher and geologist Harold Cook in 1917. An illustration of H. Harold Cookie was done by artist Amede Forestier, who modeled the drawing of the proportions of Pithecanthropus, now Homo erectus, the Java ape man, for the Illustrated News of London. Osborn was not impressed with the illustration, calling it a figment of the imagination with no scientific value and undoubtedly inaccurate. Further fieldwork on the site in 1925 revealed that the tooth was falsely identified. Other parts of the skeleton were also found. These were discovered to be tooth belonging to neither man or ape, but to an extinct genus of hog called Prosthenothrops, and its identification as an ape retracted in the journal. They found a tooth that belonged to a hog and made up this whole man out of it. And this is science. This is what they call science. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Lucy. When I took science in college, anthropology, they had her skeleton hanging in the room. Now, this is an interesting one because everybody says, well, this is hardcore evidence. Lucy was discovered in 1974 by anthropologist Professor Donald Johansen and his student Tom Gray in a maze of ravines at Hader in northern Ethiopia. It has been heralded as proof of evolution. However, as the picture shows, only partial skeleton was found and everything else was added later. Although the knee and pelvis bone were damaged, they said it walked upright and declared it a hominid. In other words, you couldn't tell if it did or not, and half the skeleton was gone. So they created the rest of it. If you can see, the one on the left is what they found. Also, I found later that they put it together from two different sites. So it wasn't even a complete skeleton. They basically pieced it together to prove evolution. The human evolution conclusions. Paleontologists have a tendency to reconstruct fossils to make what they want out of it. A single set of fossil bones can be reconstructed in many ways based on the assumptions made by the paleontologist and the artist. You understand, they're taking these things and then deciding what it looked like. Now, there's certain things we know nowadays about bone structure and muscle structure, and yes, they can do it. But when there's only pieces of the bones and things are crushed, you're going to make the rest of it up. It's ridiculous, and it's awful. They do this to teach us to children. Jonathan Wells, in his book Icons of Evolution, said, sometimes scientists have correctly stated To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, assuming perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. In other words, if they take a bunch of fossils and say, well, this one must have descended from this one, descended from this one, like they teach nowadays that dinosaurs descended from, or birds descended from dinosaurs. They make that up. They have no evidence of it. They say that the bones are similar in the hips, so it must have happened, but that is made up. They even, in some of these Jurassic movies, they've shown them with feathers, and that's made up. They found nothing that shows feathers on dinosaurs. And it's tragic. It's tragic. David Rops in Chicago Field Museum, a large number of well-trained scientists outside of evolutionary biology and paleontology have unfortunately gotten the idea that the fossil record is far more Darwinian than it is. This probably comes from the oversimplification inevitable in secondary sources, low-level textbooks, semi-popular articles, and so on. Also, there is probably some wishful thinking involved. In the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found, yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. One of the ironies of the creation-evolution debate is that the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression, and they have gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in their flood. And what he's saying is too many creationists have tried to adopt this because they believe it's proven, and it's not. It's nonsense. Now, most of the creationists I know now don't accept that, but there are some, unfortunately, who try to blend evolutionists and with these, and it's not necessary. It doesn't exist. There is nothing in any record in anything showing Darwinian evolution. S.M. Stanley in the New Evolutionary Timetable says the fossil record itself proved to be no documentation of continuity, no gradual transmission from one animal or plant to another of quite different form. What do biology texts have to say about these icons? They treat it as a theory, describe the issues clearly, discuss the possible problems, assume a true and even fact. It's completely misleading. They don't really discuss the possible problems. They assume it's a fact. When we took our family to the Natural History Museum in San Francisco, before we went into it, the person that was giving us the
docent.
The what?
Docent.
He said, now we understand that evolution is a proven fact, and so we're going to discuss it that way. We didn't go through there. There was no sense in listening to that because it's not a proven fact. It's not even a good theory anymore. Evolutionists will not acknowledge supernatural power, and evolutionists do not have an alternative. See, the problem is they don't want God, so you have to make something up, and they've made up a fairy tale. Jonathan Wells in this book said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of the evidence. Scientists are questioning the validity of so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be unsupported by the evidence. It's true, a lot of scientists have abandoned evolution. I had a video on my site a while back. I think it's been taken down by a hardcore atheist. And I taught this the first time that I taught about apologetics, he called it the 4 big bangs about the problems with evolution. And he said, you can't believe it. He believes in creation because evolution is impossible. 1 Timothy 6:20 and 21. O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid worldly and empty chatter and the opposing arguments, which is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed and thus gone astray from the faith. Grace be with you. That word knowledge, and I talked about this before, is gnosis. It's knowing the act. That is, by implication, knowledge or science. In fact, the King James Version translates science, and I think that's a very good application. It says it's what some call science. They use false arguments, and they call it science. Not everything they call science is science today. And we saw that in the recent COVID, where they would tell absolute lies, and they're still lying about it. And it is tragic because people are dying. But they don't care about that. They care about what they want to believe. And it's tragic. Isaiah 45:12 says, it is I who made the earth and created mankind upon it. My own hands outstretched out the heavens, and I marshaled their starry hosts. That puts it perfectly. Folks, God created it all. He created us. He created it all in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. We'll discuss the timetable in a couple of weeks, why you can't believe billions of years. But God created it. You can believe Genesis. You can believe the Word of God. We have an eyewitness, God. And yes, he gave the information to Moses. But did you know that there are records of the creation story all over? Not just from the Bible, but in other civilizations, they have stories that closely match the story of creation and of the Garden of Eden. It is a fact because God doesn't lie. And he didn't make this up, and he didn't make a mistake. And no, he didn't try to tell us in a way we could understand because it was too complicated. Some people have said, well, he just said it that way because evolution is complicated. No, he said exactly what happened. And that's our God. Our God is awesome and great and powerful. Never doubt that. He can create the world in 6 days. And everything you see, he did it. Believe it. You can believe it. I encourage you, believe your word. Study it. Know it. Don't believe the things people tell you when it disagrees with the word. Believe the Bible. Trust it. Trust it. It is the absolute word of God. I want to thank you, everyone, for listening, and all those who are going to listen to later on YouTube. And I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be back in our building soon. We'll keep you posted. I'm going to close with prayer now. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can trust the Word of God. It is alive. It is living. It is the truth. It is the very core of our faith. You did create the earth. You created all that exists. You created the heavens and the earth. You created the angels. You created even the demons, the fallen angels. And you created every person in the womb. And every person has a purpose, has a life because of you, and is made in the image of God and has value. And we thank you for that, God. We don't have to believe the stories of man and the lies of man, because people lie all the time, Father. Lord, help us to believe. And now keep us and go with us and bless us in your holy name. Amen. God bless and have a great evening.